My parents saved my sister from every mess, even a drunk driving crash. I spoke up, and they cut me off for starting drama. When her destructive lifestyle finally caught up to her, they came to me for help. My younger sister, who I'll call Nikki, could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. She was their golden child. I, on the other hand, always seemed to be the one who was expected to be responsible, make no mistakes, and deal with the consequences when things went wrong. From the outside, people might have thought we were just a normal family, but anyone close enough could see the imbalance. Nikki got away with everything. Small things were always brushed aside. If we both did something wrong, it was always my fault. I remember when we were kids, we were playing outside, and Nikki threw a baseball through our neighbor's window. I wasn't even near her at the time, but somehow I ended up being the one grounded for it. I was told I should have been watching out for her. Another time I got in trouble for getting a B on a math test, while Nikki, who failed the same test, didn't even get a scolding. Nikki just needs a little more help, they said, but for me there was no room for error. That pattern repeated itself for years. I didn't complain because honestly it was just normal by then. My parents favored Nikki, and that was that. I kept my head down, did what I had to, and figured eventually they'd see the truth. Things started to change when we both became adults. Nikki got into more serious trouble, but the favoritism didn't stop. A few months ago, the tipping point finally came. Nikki had crashed her car after a night out. No one was hurt, thankfully, but it was clear she'd been drinking. When she came home, my parents immediately went into to protect Nikki mode. They didn't lecture her, didn't tell her off nothing. They just made sure to keep things quiet, assuring her they'd help her fix everything. I stood there watching the whole thing unfold. Part of me wasn't even surprised. I knew exactly how this would go. They'd cover for her like they always did and pretend it never happened. But this time, something in me just couldn't let it go. I wasn't angry, but I was done staying quiet. I confronted Nikki right then and there in front of our parents. I told her that crashing the car wasn't something that could just be ignored. She needed to take responsibility. I pointed out that she was lucky no one was hurt and that covering for her wouldn't help her in the long run. She just shrugged it off like it wasn't a big deal. My parents, of course, jumped in to defend her immediately. It was just an accident, they said. She's learned her lesson. I wasn't having it. I reminded them about all the times they bailed her out, how they'd always cleaned up her messes, and how that had never helped her change. This wasn't just a small mistake. It was reckless, and they were enabling it. My parents didn't like hearing that. Things escalated fast. My mom got defensive, saying I was being too hard on Nikki, that I was trying to make trouble where there was none. My dad told me to stop blowing things out of proportion, but I didn't stop. I laid it all out calmly but firmly. I talked about all the times they'd let her off the hook, all the times I'd been punished for things she did, and how they'd always held me to a completely different standard. I wasn't attacking them. I was just telling them the truth, but the more I talked, the angrier they got. They kept defending Nikki, saying she was still young and needed support. They completely ignored the fact that she was an adult now and that her actions had real consequences. The more I tried to reason with them, the more heated the conversation became. Then came the ultimatum. My dad, visibly frustrated, told me that if I couldn't stop causing drama, then maybe I didn't need to be part of the family anymore. He said I should either apologize to Nikki and move on or leave. The words hit me hard, but they didn't surprise me. After everything, I guess it had always been heading in this direction. I took a deep breath and made my decision. I wasn't going to apologize because I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't going to keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. So I left right then and there. I packed a bag and walked out, disowned on the spot for standing up to the golden child. After leaving, I cut all contact with them. It was a strange feeling stepping away from everything I'd known, but it was also a relief. For the first time, I didn't have to deal with a constant pressure, the unfair treatment, or the endless cycle of favoritism. It was like a weight had been lifted, even though knew this wasn't over. Nikki and my parents would have to face the consequences sooner or later. Covering for her this time wouldn't work forever. Crashing a car while drunk wasn't something that could just be swept under the rug, and I knew that eventually the truth would catch up with them. I wasn't hoping for it, but I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before everything started falling apart. For now, though, I was focused on building a new life, one that didn't revolve around constantly cleaning up someone else's mess. Whether or not my family ever realized the cost of their favoritism was out of my hands, but deep down, I had a feeling it was only a matter of time before they'd come knocking asking for help. And when they did, I wasn't sure I'd be there to answer. After cutting off contact with my family, I focused on building a life that didn't involve constantly being in the shadow of Nikki. For the first time in a long while, I felt free from the constant comparisons, the impossible expectations, and the weight of cleaning up after her. It didn't take long to settle into a routine work, seeing friends, and just living life without worrying about my family's messes. But even as I moved forward, the fallout from Nikki's latest screw-up was just beginning. Crashing her car after a night of drinking wasn't something that could be hidden forever. I knew my parents had covered for her at first, but I also knew the legal system wasn't something they could control. I hadn't heard from them directly since I walked out, but news still reached me through mutual connections. A few weeks after I cut ties, I heard from a cousin that things weren't going so well for Nikki. It turned out that the car accident had some pretty serious consequences. While no one was hurt, the damage to the car and the property she crashed into was expensive. The insurance company wasn't going to cover for everything, especially once they found out alcohol was involved. Nikki was facing not just the repair bills but also some legal trouble, likely a DUI charge. Apparently, my parents had been scrambling to keep things under wraps, but the more they tried, the more things spiraled. The bills were piling up and they had to hire a lawyer to help Nikki avoid jail time. They had spent a good chunk of their savings trying to fix things, and it wasn't enough. I wasn't surprised. It was the kind of situation I had seen coming for years. I stayed out of it. I had no interest in getting involved, and I didn't feel any sympathy for Nikki or my parents. This was the mess they had created by enabling her for so long. They had made their choice, and now they were living with the consequences. I kept my distance, but it wasn't long before their problems started to come closer to me. Nikki, unsurprisingly, didn't take responsibility for any of it. From what I heard, she wasn't showing any signs of learning from her mistakes. Instead, she seemed to expect everything to be taken care of for her just like always. When things didn't go smoothly, she tried to find a way out. At one point, I got a message from an old friend of ours asking if I could talk to Nikki. Apparently, Nikki had been trying to reach out to me through social media, but I hadn't seen any of it since I blocked her. She wanted to clear the air and hoped I could help her out of this mess. I wasn't surprised. Nikki had always relied on me to fix things even when we were kids. She probably thought I'd step in and make everything better like I used to, but this time I wasn't playing along. I told my friend to pass on the message that I wasn't interested in talking to Nikki or getting involved. Whatever trouble she was in, she would have to deal with it herself. I wasn't going to be her safety net anymore. As time went on, things only seemed to get worse for my family. From what I gathered, my parents were now facing serious financial issues because of the legal fees and damages from the accident. The repairs to the car, the property damage, and the lawyer's fees were stacking up. They had dipped into their retirement savings to cover the costs, and it was starting to take a toll. My parents, who had once seemed so sure of themselves, were now struggling to keep everything afloat. There was a certain irony in it all. For years, they had brushed off my concerns, dismissing me when I pointed out that their favoritism toward Nikki was setting her up for failure, and now they were the ones paying the price for her recklessness. It wasn't just financial either. From what I heard through relatives, the stress was starting to affect them emotionally. They were arguing more and the pressure was getting to them. It seemed like the perfect storm was finally catching up with them, and they were starting to realize just how deep they were in it. Nikki, on the other hand, wasn't helping the situation. Instead of taking responsibility, she was still acting like nothing was her fault. She'd been skipping court dates and avoiding any real consequences. This only made things worse for my parents, who were left to deal with the fallout. The more she avoided her problems, the more they had to step in, and it was dragging them down with her. The turning point came when I heard from another cousin that my parents might lose the house. Between the legal fees, the repairs, and the fact that Nikki still wasn't contributing anything financially, they were in danger of foreclosure. They had borrowed money from other family members, but that well had dried up. My cousin hinted that my parents were desperate and might try reaching out to me soon. I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't looking forward to it either. The thought of my parents asking for help after everything they had put me through wasn't something I wanted to deal with. They had made their bed and now they were lying in it. I wasn't going to swoop in and save them from the mess they had created, but I couldn't help but feel that something bigger was on the horizon. The deeper Nikki sank, the more pressure my parents felt, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to pull me back into the chaos. The situation was unraveling fast, and the consequences were piling up faster than they could handle. I didn't know what their next move would be, but I had a feeling they wouldn't go down without a fight. The question wasn't if they tried to reconnect, it was when, and when that time came, I had to be ready. It was a few months after I'd cut ties with my family when the inevitable happened. My parents finally reached out. For a long time, I had heard bits and pieces about their struggles through cousins and family friends. Nikki's situation had gone from bad to worse. Her legal troubles were piling up, and my parents were running out of money trying to clean up her mess. They were losing control, and the consequences of their choices were closing in on them. I hadn't expected them to reach out, but I wasn't surprised when they did. One evening, I got a message from my mom. It was short and to the point. They needed to talk. After months of silence, they had finally decided to break the ice, but not for the reasons you'd expect. They weren't apologizing for how they had treated me or for disowning me. Instead, they were desperate to rope me back in to fix everything just like old times. According to my mom, things had gotten complicated with Nikki. Her legal situation had spiraled out of control. The DUI charge she was facing had snowballed into something much bigger, and there were now court dates, fines, and the possibility of jail time. My parents, who had always been able to shield her from consequences, were now at a loss. They didn't have the money to keep paying for lawyers, and Nikki wasn't showing any signs of stepping up to take responsibility. Their financial situation had gotten so bad that they were on the brink of losing the house. It was a strange message, filled with the tone of both desperation and manipulation. My mom framed it as though they had no other choice but to turn to me. There was no acknowledgement of how they had disowned me, no real apology for the years of unfair treatment. It was more like they were saying, "You were right, but now we need your help." The way she worded it made it clear that while they might have admitted I was wronged, they still didn't fully take responsibility for their actions. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I thought about how much had changed in the time since I had left. My life had been so much better without the constant stress of dealing with my family's drama. I had built a life for myself that didn't revolve around cleaning up Nikki's messes or feeling like the forgotten child. I wasn't about to throw that all away just because they were finally facing the consequences of their decisions. After a few days, I replied. I kept it simple. I wasn't going to get involved. I told them that their situation was a direct result of the choices they had made, enabling Nikki ignoring my warnings and choosing to disown me when I tried to stand up for myself. I didn't know them anything, especially not now. I had moved on, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix what they had broken. Their response was predictable. My mom tried to guilt-trip me, talking about how family comes first, and how I was being cold-hearted by refusing to help them in their time of need. She brought up all the times they had sacrificed for me, conveniently forgetting that those sacrifices had always been overshadowed by their favoritism toward Nikki. My dad chimed in later, but his message was more blunt. He said I was being selfish and that I was abandoning them when they needed me most, but I didn't budge. The reality was, they had abandoned me long before I ever walked out the door. They had made it clear where I stood in the family hierarchy, and now that the golden child had turned their lives upside down, they expected me to step in and save them. I wasn't going to play that game anymore. As the days went by, more details about their situation came to light from what I heard through extended family. The fallout from Nikki's actions had reached new heights. Not only were they struggling financially, but the legal troubles had brought public embarrassment as well. Word had spread in their social circles about Nikki's DUI and the other reckless behavior she had gotten involved in. Their reputation, which they had always valued so highly, wasn't matters. They were losing friends, losing face, and losing everything they had worked to protect for years. It was hard to feel sorry for them. This was the reality they had created by refusing to hold Nikki accountable for anything. Now that everything was crumbling, they were learning the hard way that favoritism and denial weren't enough to shield them from the consequences of their choices, but even then they couldn't admit their role in all of it. They still framed it as though they were victims of circumstance rather than architects of their own downfall. Then things escalated. One afternoon, I was at work when I saw my dad waiting outside the building. It was shocking to say the least. I hadn't seen either of my parents in person since the day I walked out, and here he was standing outside my workplace like it was no big deal. I didn't go out to meet him. Instead, I stayed inside and waited until he eventually left. Later, I got a message from him saying he had just wanted to talk face to face and that I was being unreasonable by ignoring him. He acted like showing up at my work unannounced was normal, as if it was just a casual drop-in. That crossed the line for me. I had made it clear that I didn't want to be involved, but now they were trying to pressure me into helping by showing up where I worked. I realized then that this wasn't going to stop unless I took drastic measures. My parents were spiraling, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get me back into the fold, even if it meant crossing boundaries that shouldn't have been crossed. It was time to put an end to it once and for all. I didn't know what their next move would be, but I knew I had to protect my peace. Whatever they were planning next, I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their chaos. It was time to take a stand once and for all. After my dad showed up at my workplace, I knew things were going to get worse. I had already cut off contact, but now my parents were desperate, and desperation makes people do irrational things. What I didn't realize at the time was just how far they were willing to go to pull me back into their mess. It started with more messages this time, not just from my parents, but from other family members. My aunt, a couple of cousins, and even some distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had urgent reasons to contact me. Some messages were disguised as casual check-ins, while others were more direct. They told me that my parents were in over their heads and that it was time for me to step in and help. I didn't engage. I knew this wasn't about reconnecting for the sake of family. It was about them pressuring me to clean up the mess they couldn't handle anymore. Then things escalated. One morning I woke up to find a string of texts from a number I didn't recognize. It was Nikki. Somehow she had gotten a new number and decided to reach out to me directly, bypassing the blocks I had put up on every other platform. Her messages were a mix of blame and demands. She acted like I had abandoned her, like everything she was going through was somehow my fault for not being there to fix it. From what I gathered, Nikki's situation had deteriorated even further. She had skipped a court date for the DUI case, and a warrant had been issued for her arrest. She was on the run, trying to avoid jail time, but it was clear she didn't have a plan. She mentioned something about needing money to sort things out and implied that our parents were running out of resources to help her. It was the same old story. Nikki messed up, and now she wanted someone else to fix it. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked the new number and went about my day, but it didn't stop there. A few days later, I came home to find my parents waiting outside my apartment building. I hadn't told them where I lived, but they had somehow found out. They didn't knock on my door. They just sat in their car hoping I would come out and talk to them. I didn't. I waited them out, watching from my window as they sat there for hours before finally driving off. That was the final straw for me. I knew I couldn't just wait for them to stop. They weren't going to give up. My parents had crossed every boundary I had set, and their behavior was only getting more erratic. The pressure was relentless, and it was clear that they were in full-blown denial about how serious Nikki's situation had become. They couldn't face the fact that the golden child they had protected for so long had finally brought everything crashing down. Nikki, meanwhile, was still making terrible decisions. From what I heard through mutual friends, she had started lying to the authorities, giving them false information to delay her court proceedings. She was dodging her responsibilities at every turn, but it was catching up to her. The more she ran, the more trouble she found herself in. There were rumors that she was involved in something shady, maybe drugs or illegal dealings, but no one seemed to know the full story. What was clear, though, was that Nikki had no intention of changing. She was still the same reckless, irresponsible person she had always been, only now she was dragging my parents down with her. I had to take action. I contacted a lawyer and had a cease and desist letter drafted, making it clear that if my parents continued to harass me or show up unannounced, I would take legal steps to protect myself. It was a drastic move, but it was necessary. They had pushed me to my limit, and I needed to protect my peace. Sending that letter was harder than I thought it would be. Despite everything, they were still my parents, and part of me hoped they would finally understand that they had gone too far, but I knew better than to expect that. They had spent years denying reality, and this was just another step in their refusal to accept the truth. The CE and DS letter worked at least temporarily. I didn't hear from them for a while, and Nikki went silent as well, but I knew this wasn't the end. I had cut off all remaining contact with my family, making it clear that there was no going back. The divide between us was final, and there was no way to repair the damage they had done. In the meantime, I kept hearing bits and pieces about their situation from other family members. My parents were struggling more than ever. The house was on the verge of foreclosure, their social standing had crumbled, and Nikki was still on the run. It was only a matter of time before everything fell apart completely. They had spent years protecting Nikki from the consequences of her actions, and now those consequences were hitting them harder than they ever could have imagined. As much as I had distanced myself from the situation, there was still a sense of finality looming. My parents were finally facing the full weight of their choices. They had built their entire world around Nikki, excusing every mistake she made, and now that world was collapsing. I couldn't help but wonder how they were coping with the reality that they had refused to see for so long. I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication. It was just the inevitable result of years of denial and bad decisions. I had tried to warn them, but they had refused to listen. Now they were paying the price. There was no going back for me. I had made my decision to cut ties, and I was sticking to it. No matter what happened next, I knew I had done everything I could to protect myself from the chaos they had created. The chapter was closed, and for the first time I felt like I was truly free from the burden of being the one who always had to fix things. What came next for them was out of my hands. I had done my part, and now it was time for them to finally face the consequences of their own making. Several months passed without a word from my parents after I sent the cease and desist letter. Life went on, and I started to feel a sense of normalcy again. The constant tension that surrounded myself with people who supported me, friends who had become like family. It was peaceful, but part of me always knew it wouldn't last forever. My parents were too deep in their denial to just let things go. Eventually, they'd try again, and they did. One morning, I got a letter in the mail. It was from my mom, handwritten and lengthy. I didn't even open it right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to, but after sitting with it for a day, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to read it. The letter was different from anything I had received from her before. For this time, it wasn't filled with guilt trips or demands. Instead, there was an air of desperation. My parents were broken financially and emotionally. They had lost the house foreclosed after they drained their savings to pay for Nikki's legal fees. Socially, they had become paras in their community. Word had gotten out about Nikki's actions, and their reputation had been completely destroyed. It seemed that for the first time they had hit rock bottom. In the letter, my mom admitted they had been wrong. She didn't go into detail, but there was an acknowledgement that they hadn't treated me fairly and that dissing me had been a mistake. It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I had ever expected. My mom wrote that they were sorry for how things had played out and that they wanted to reconnect, not just for help, but because they missed me. They begged for forgiveness, asking if there was any way we could start over. I sat with the letter for a while, unsure of how to respond. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy for them. They were truly broken, and I could see the pain in every word my mom wrote, but at the same time, I couldn't forget the years of neglect, the favoritism, and the way they had dismissed me when I needed them most. Forgiveness was complicated. I weighed my options carefully. I could let them back into my life, but it would have to be on my terms. The relationship would never go back to what it was before, and I knew I would need strict boundaries if I even considered reconnecting. On the other hand, I could close the chapter with them for good. They had hurt me deeply, and there was no guarantee that letting them back in wouldn't lead to the same toxic patterns resurfacing. In the end, I made my decision. I wasn't going to ignore them, but I wasn't about to open my arms fully either. I decided to reach out with a clear set of boundaries. I sent a short response letting them know that while I appreciated the letter in their attempt to reconcile things, could never go back to the way they were. If they wanted to reconnect, it would be on my terms. I made it clear that Nikki was not my responsibility, and I wouldn't be dragged into her problems again. I also told them that I needed space, no sudden visits, no pressure. We could take things slow and see where it went, but I wasn't making any promises. They responded quickly, almost too quickly. They agreed to the boundaries I had set, saying they understood why I needed to protect myself. There was a sense of relief in their message, as if they were holding on to the hope that this might lead to a real reconciliation. But I wasn't naive. I knew better than to expect them to change overnight. This was just the first step, and I wasn't letting my guard down. In the weeks that followed, we exchanged a few more messages. My parents kept things light, asking how I was doing, but not pushing too hard. I appreciated the effort, but there was still a distance between us that I didn't think could ever be fully closed. They had spent so many years putting Nikki first, and the damage from that couldn't be undone with a few letters. As for Nikki, she was still spiraling. I heard through the grapevine that she had been arrested after skipping another court date. Her reckless decisions had finally caught up to her, and this time, there was no getting out of it. My parents didn't mention her much in their messages, and I didn't ask. It was clear that Nikki was still the center of their world, even as everything around her crumbled. Despite the slow trickle of communication with my parents, I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to dive back into their lives, and honestly, I didn't think I ever would be. I had found peace without them, and I wasn't willing to risk losing that. The new family I had built for myself, friends who cared for me, supported me, and treated me with respect, was more important to me than repairing the broken relationship with my parents. In the end, I didn't feel the need for a dramatic reconciliation. Life wasn't a movie, and sometimes things didn't wrap up neatly. I had made my decision, and I was content with it. My parents might never fully understand the hurt they caused, and that was okay. I had drawn my boundaries, and that was what mattered. As I look back on everything that happened, I realized that the most important thing I gained from all of this was self-respect. I learned to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, and to walk away from toxic situations, even when they involve family. There was no going back to the way things were, but I had found peace in moving forward. Family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who respect you, and who are there when it matters most. I found my family and the people around me, and that's more than enough. In the end, the consequences of unchecked favoritism had torn my family apart. But from the ruins of that old life, I built something stronger, something better, and that's all I ever needed.